Hi, Kristen of woollypetals here. We are in week 1 of the new Star Beginner Quilt Course, and today we're talking about fabric. Quilting fabric, what is it and where do we buy it and what should we look for? So quilting fabric is 100% cotton fabric, and it usually is a printed design on that 100% cotton fabric. Different manufacturers will have different base cloth that they use. So you will learn over time, not all quilting fabric is made exactly alike because of those base cloths. Some are higher thread count, some are thicker, some have maybe a sheen or a slippery hand to them. So it kind of varies by company, and you might tend to lean or gravitate towards one over the other as you get to know them. Quilting fabric is typically designed in collections. So this is a really great collection. And it is probably 20-ish prints that are all designed to coordinate. Some of those prints are in different colorways for the same fabric, but they all coordinate together. You could take any 3 fabrics from this pile and they would 100% coordinate with each other. Or you could take the whole pile and make a quilt out of this whole pile of fabric. So that's typically how I believe fabric is designed, is a designer creates a collection of prints and they color it all to coordinate and they sell it with a manufacturer. Quilt shops order that collection. Once they receive that collection, they sell it to us, the consumer. So often quilt shops will have a full line of fabric, or a lot of times too, they won't. They'll pick what they think is the best prints for their customers and only have those prints in their shop. Now, there's a lot of great fabric designers, there's a lot of great fabric companies, and there's a lot of great quilt shops. What should I look for in each of them over another? Probably didn't say that correctly, but kind of learning which fabric companies you like their base fabric for and working with that. You can mix fabrics from different companies, mix different thicknesses and different weights. This is a fabric that is really great, a little bit thinner, it has a little bit more of a softer hand. And then I put it up next to a fabric like this, which is a little bit thicker, but they would both work really great together in a quilt. So mixing different companies and different fabrics and different lines of fabric is not something to worry about. The reason most of the time fabric companies work with a line of fabric is to make picking fabric easier for you. Some quilts require 5, 10, 20, 30 fabrics, and if you can go grab this line of fabric, that is so much easier for some people than from going through a wall of fabric and trying to pick things that coordinate. There's also a little bit of supply and demand with fabric. I don't love that about the quilting community, but once lines of fabric are sold out, there's not a lot of quilt fabric companies that reprint. Some do, but some don't. So you have to kind of keep that in mind. If you really love a fabric and it's from a company that doesn't reprint it, you might want to buy a little extra for your stash and have it for the future. Where to shop for fabric? Quilt stores. If you have a local quilt store, you might not know that you have a local quilt store, so look it up. Online quilt shops and big box fabric stores also. Now, my favorite is, of course, the in-person small quilt shop. But maybe you don't have a local quilt shop. Maybe that local quilt shop doesn't have the fabric that you really love. So going online is a great option. I do often find too that online quilt shops have a larger selection, or where a brick and mortar shop, just due to space, they might not order all the prints in a line of fabric, but an online fabric store, usually shipping from a warehouse, sometimes shipping from a brick and mortar, but they often have a little bit more space and fabric turns over quicker. So they typically do order full lines of fabric. Something to think about. I love my local quilt shop, but also they don't have everything that I would buy. So I split online and in person. You may also find that an in-person store, their prices might be slightly higher to compensate for the fact that they have to pay rent and they have employees and stuff like that. It's good to support everybody. I will have a list on my blog post for week 1 of some of the online fabric shops that I frequent. So let's talk a little bit about how much fabric you need to order, or fabric quantities, and kind of that type of a thing. I do have a downloadable table that you can download as a PDF onto your phone or save it to your Pinterest, and it easily tells you yardage amounts in normal increments, fractions converted to decimals, so you can do some quilt math, and different sizes of fabric that you can buy. Just it's kind of like a cheat sheet for fabric. So typically fabric is sold in yardage in the US. This might be different in the UK. I'm based in the US, so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Yardage for quilt fabric, let's just take a look at it. So a yard of fabric is 36 inches tall, but that does not include the width. So a width of fabric, let me just step back here for a second, is this. It goes from selvage edge on this side to selvage edge on this side. And a selvage is literally where it is attached to the machine that prints it. So you're not going to use the selvage edge in your quilting. You're going to cut that off. And often when fabric is on the bolt, it is folded selvage to selvage, and there's a nice crisp crease all down the center, and then it's wrapped on the bolt like this. So this is a bolt of fabric. It's a cardboard bolt, and you can see it just kind of rolls off the bolt, and the bottom is the salvages, and they are folded together. Sorry, this is a little bit awkward. 2 salvages, and the top edge here is that folded edge. So that's how it comes off the bolt. And when you're measuring a yard of fabric, you're measuring from this cut edge up the 36 inches, or half a yard up 18 inches. So that's good to know. Typically, quilting cotton from salvage to salvage is somewhere between 40 to 42 inches wide. And I would say the 40 to 42 inches wide does not include the salvages. It would be after cutting the salvages off. Some companies, like Ruby Star is one of them, print really beautiful salvages, and a lot of people like to use those as fabric in their quilt, or cut them off and save them for bag making, pouches, in minis, or wall hangings. So that's something to consider too. But typically, when a pattern is telling you how much usable yardage, salvage to salvage, I'm pretty sure they're almost always not counting the actual unusable salvage. They are counting just the usable fabric between the salvages. So this is about 1.5 yards of fabric. It's very big. This is the top part that would be on the bolt. These are the salvages together. And when they're measuring it, they're measuring from a cut edge all the way and then cutting 1.5 yards. So when I get it home and I open it up, it is twice as wide as it looks when it comes off the bolt. So that's something to remember, how wide your fabric is, salvage to salvage. So most fabric shops sell in yardage, half yards, 1/4 yards. Some do 1/8 of a yard. Not everybody will even do 1/4 of a yard. So So that's something to know. For my stash, I often buy a half yard of fabric, and that's about this size. That is for things that I just want to buy to put in my stash to pull quilts from, not something that I would usually buy when I'm buying for a specific pattern, like the new Star pattern. You are going to buy specific amounts of fabric. If it's a fabric that I super love and I know I will use a lot, I will probably buy 1 to 2 yards, depending on if I've seen it before, if I know that I can get it other places. So those are just some parameters to keep in mind for when you're building your stash. When you're buying fabric for a specific quilt, you will go off of the fabric requirements in that quilt pattern. So other than standard like fabric by the yard, quilt shops will often sell pre-cuts, and that is fabric that either the manufacturer has cut into predetermined sizes or the quilt shop has cut into predetermined sizes. Some of those things might include like a layer cake, which is a stack of 10-inch squares, usually all from the same line of fabric. Depending on if it's a layer cake or a junior layer cake, will determine how many squares you get in that stack of fabric. They also have charm packs like that and mini charms packs. Charm packs are 5-inch squares and mini charm packs are 2.5-inch squares. Now there's also fat quarters. So you may remember me saying a 1/4 yard of fabric. A 1/4 yard of fabric would be 9 inches tall from cut edge to cut edge, and then the whole width of your selvage to selvage. So this is 18 inches. If we were to cut it in half lengthwise, this would be a 1/4 yard. So a fat quarter is the exact same amount of fabric, but it's cut differently. So you might be able to get a larger piece cut out of it. It's cut from half selvage halfway to other selvage. So it's half the width of fabric and it's 18 inches tall. So it's twice as tall as a 1/4 yard of fabric, which is 9 inches. So this is a very common cut. Fabric shops cut this a lot and just have fat quarters stuck on shelves throughout their store. And that bundle I showed you earlier of 1 line of fabric is all fat quarters. Quilt shops and manufacturers will cut fat quarter bundles for a line of fabric and sell them like that. It's a great amount of fabric. Usually you can make a whole quilt from 1 fat quarter bundle. It's a great way to sample fabric if you're not sure if you like that color, or if it's a fabric that you just aren't sure you'll use a ton of. And it's quick and easy. Sometimes you don't want to wait in line for somebody to cut all these fabrics for you, so you just grab a bunch of fat quarters and go. That's the most common pre-cut that you'll find in quilt shops, and even online quilt shops will often sell them. There's other ones, fat 8ths, fat 16ths, and there's things called jelly rolls, which are strips of fabric, all from the same line again. There's a bunch of different things like that, and you'll kind of learn about those over time in the quilting community. For the new Star quilt pattern, let's just talk about your fabric requirements real quick. Let's talk about real quick print on fabric. Something to consider for the new Star quilt pattern is color and scale. So because in the new Star quilt pattern, you are using squares of fabric to create a pattern in your quilt, you want those squares of fabric to be saturated. You want to be able to see the pattern and not have those squares all blend together and get lost. So what I would recommend is fabrics that read as one color, even if they have other colors on them. So that's called a blender. And that's a lot of what I sew with. I bought a lot of fabric when I first started quilting because it's beautiful, and I still think a lot of that fabric is beautiful. I love fabric, but I've learned over time that I mostly sew with blenders. I don't sew with large scale prints very often, and I like fabrics that have a smaller to medium size scale print and often read as one color from a distance. So I have a couple different fabrics here I'm going to share that all I would consider are blenders, but you can see are different scales of pattern. So this is the first one. It's kind of a larger scale print, but it's not huge. It's maybe medium. And it does have multiple colors, but from a distance, you're going to still read this as a purple and a more solid feel to it. This is also a blender, but again, from a distance, it reads more like one color. Again, we have another blender. And again, while you do see that white a little bit more than maybe some of the other ones I held up, still the overall vibe is a purple fabric. So those are what I would consider blenders. And that's what I work with a lot. There are definitely blenders that are even more blendy, so to speak. Like this is really just two colors, and it's such a minimal pattern. As you pull away from it, it does read more solid. And we have some things like this that are very organic in their color and print. And as we pull away, it really reads it as a solid. So that's just something to keep in mind about blenders. Most fabric lines will have quite a few blenders because it helps tie everything together. And a lot of fabric lines will have one or two main prints that have a lot of colors or a lot of pattern, and those blenders help blend everything together and tie together. Something that is not a blender would be this fabric that I held up before, my half-yard fabric. And you can see it is very much a pattern. It's a small scale pattern, but it definitely reads multiple colors. So this one is not one that I would necessarily use in my new star quilt because of that and because I know my style. That doesn't mean you can't do that, because you might love something that's more patterned like this, and you may not love blenders. I kind of am just telling you this to help you understand different scale and size of prints. We also have ones, I would say something like this, a fabric that could be considered a blender, but also isn't really a blender. So you have definitely different levels of how much things are going to blend, how much things aren't going to blend. And I think it's really good to look at your pattern and what you're sewing and make sure that the fabrics you pick are going to work well with the style of quilt or pattern of quilt you're making. In the new Star Beginner quilt, it has a lot of squares, a lot of small pieces. So I'm not 100% positive that going with a lot of large scale or fabrics that have a lot of colors is going to work well for that. It might read a little bit too chaotic. So I talk a little bit about this in the other video for week 1 that has quilt math in it as well. But on page 4 and 5 of the pattern, you're going to have information about how much fabric you need to purchase. And for the quilt course, we are sewing the cover quilt, which is 5 fabrics. And it's a purple fabric, a pink fabric, dark blue, light blue, and yellow. Now, what you could do is pick out these exact fabrics, so to speak. I mean, I don't say what my exact fabrics are, but you could pick out a pink one, a purple one, and so on. Or you can take whatever fabric you love and sub in something for the pink, sub in something for the purple, sub in something for the dark blue, and so on. And then you would go to your cover quilt fabric requirements, look at the colors noted, and sub in your color for the color noted and buy that amount of fabric for that color of fabric. And you're going to use your coloring sheet to help you remember which fabric is replaced for what as you're sewing. And I would kind of on the pattern, if you've printed it out, mark off pink and write in green, mark off yellow and write in orange, something like that to keep track. You could also cut a little snip of your fabric, staple it on next to the color that you're subbing in for. Okay, the last thing I'd like to kind of talk about is fabric requirements, fabric amounts from a pattern. So most pattern designers will include enough fabric and maybe a little extra to cut all of the pieces you need. I always tend to buy just a little bit extra, maybe a 1/4 of a yard extra, and then that extra can go into my stash. That gives me a little leeway into if I cut something wrong or if I don't cut enough or I decide, hey, I do want to make this quilt slightly bigger. All of those things, if you don't have extra fabric, there are possibilities that you might not be able to find it. So I've had that happen where I've pulled from my stash and I didn't have enough fabric, and then I go to search for it. And granted, your stash is a little bit different story because some of this has been here for years, but I haven't been able to find that fabric because it is too old. And so, I mean, I'll just go to the store and replace it with something. It's not a big deal. But that's just something to kind of keep in mind, is that it can be really nice to have just a little extra fabric than what the fabric requirements say. And I would say the only caveat to that is if it's something you don't think you would use again. So what I would recommend is you watch all the videos for week 1. You decide what fabrics you're going to use for the quilt, if you're going to sew the cover quilt or if you're going to design your own, and you can learn a little bit more about that in the other video for week 1. And then once you know which quilt you're making and what fabrics you're choosing or what colors of fabric you're choosing, you can go to the quilt shop or online and purchase your fabric based on the fabric amounts in the pattern or based on, in the other video, how you learned how to turn a single fabric into scrappy fabrics and buy multiple fabrics in place of one fabric. So that's kind of what you need to do for week 1, is get all of your supplies and fabric in order. If you haven't watched the videos for supplies, that is already on my website prior to week 1. And in the new Star Beginner Quilt Course tab on the woollypetals.com website, you can find links to the YouTube video as well as the blog post about supplies to know what you're going to need and what is great for a beginner. Check out the 3rd video for week 1, which is me actually pulling fabric from my stash for a new Star quilt that I designed, and kind of my process and how I coordinate fabrics, if that is something you're not really sure about.